Wise Child by Monica Furlong, Chapter 19, The Arrest. That winter was one of the hardest that I can remember. It began with a pervading wetness, continual rain, damp and mist that went on for weeks, and the wheat and rye and oats, which had stood so fine and tawny under the golden sun of August, began to mildew in the barns. By Christmas the wet had turned to snow, and when lambing time came, many of the sheep and their little ones died in the snow, though the men worked till all hours to get to them. What this meant was that our people, never well fed, would come close to starvation before the spring. In their desperation they would bleed the cattle and mix the blood with their children's food to give them strength. But then the weakened cattle might die or not have the strength to breed healthy stock. As the cruel winter wore on, the children grew scrawnier, and the mothers more tired-looking, the fathers surlier. To make matters worse, there was rumour of smallpox on the mainland. There had been no smallpox on the island for many years. The unscarred faces of all but the old people showed that it was 50 years since the scourge last came, but everyone was afraid of its return. It was the middle of that winter that Coleman came one afternoon, when he should have been at school. He seemed uneasy, restless, both in his body and in his mind. We settled in front of the glowing peat fire with a honey drink of Juniper's invention and some oat cakes plastered with butter. Juniper was looking for some root or leaf, but I knew that there was nothing she liked better than to fill Coleman's hungry stomach. Some grunt or grimace of Coleman's as we settled on our cushions put an idea into my head. "Did your dad beat you?" I asked sympathetically. Coleman hated it to be mentioned, but I wanted to know. The drink's lovely. I've got something to say." His honest eyes turned to my face. "Don't come to our house and don't come to Mass on Sunday." He saw the deep hurt on my face. I put a hand out to reassure me. "It's not Morag and me and the others, just Gregor. He's afraid of Filian Priest." "But not to come to Mass, though, and not to see the little ones any more." My eyes filled with tears. "Why?" "It's just for now. It'll blow over. It's just that Filian says Juniper has bewitched the grain and she'll make the smallpox come." "That's silly. Why should she do that? And you're my kin. You should stick up for me." "I shan't stop coming, and Morag would come if she dared." "But will he let you come? I mean, won't he?" My voice trailed away as I understood why Coleman's dad had beaten him. "You are good," I whispered, in my turn, putting out a hand to touch Coleman's arm. "But be careful. Don't let him hurt you. I will understand if you can't come." Only much later did I think that this was the first grown-up conversation that Coleman and I ever had. "That wouldn't be right," said Coleman crossly. It was like him to be cross when he wanted to say... It was like him to be cross when what he wanted to say was that he needed to come. After we finished our drinks in silence, his pale face flushed fuller-looking, he said at last, "Perhaps you should make plans for you and Juniper." "Plans?" "To get away if you have to." "But this is our home, and there's Daisy and Cormac and the cats and the herbs. We can't go away." "It might be better than some other things." "You said yourself it would blow over. You don't think the people around here would hurt Juniper, do you? She's so good to them." "People are like a pack of dogs sometimes," Coleman said. "All right, one by one, but together they do awful things they don't mean to do." Nameless terrors clutched at me. It felt like a hand squeezing my entrails. When there's a bad winter and people are hungry and frightened, they want to blame somebody for it. With Filian's encouragement, they are beginning to blame Juniper. "Perhaps God is angry with them," I said righteously. Coleman looked at me in disappointment. "Why should God be angry with them? The work in the fields, all the hours of the day, and sometimes of the night as well. They do the best they can. They are good people, but they get weak and afraid, and Filian stirs them up." "Why?" "He's sick, that one. My mother says so." I was so distressed by this conversation with Coleman that I put it right out of my mind and did not mention it to Juniper. I had heard what sometimes happened to witches on the mainland, but I could not believe that it could happen here. Not to Juniper. The next afternoon she and I went down to the village. She had been sent for to see a woman who had a milk infection. The tiny room was bitterly cold. Jean lay on a mattress. under which crumbs of plaster fell, and she had a tiny baby in the bed beside her, presumably to keep it warm. The baby cried continually in a thin, piercing voice. Juniper had knocked gently on the door. Getting no reply, had lifted the latch. "All alone?" she said to Jean. It was surprising. Usually sick people in our village had 2 or 3 friends sitting by them in their distress, and Juniper was used to working in front of an interested and curious audience. An uneasy, secretive look passed over Jean's pleasant face. Juniper lifted the tiny baby, wrapped her in her own shawl, and gave her to me to hold. "We'll try her with a little goat's milk presently," she said. "Meanwhile, walk her up and down a little." I held the tiny, smelly bundle. Her yellow face puckered in misery. Juniper turned her attention to Jean, giving her a draught for the infection, with instructions to take more, baring her sore breasts and holding them thoughtfully in her brown hands, muttering words as if she were addressing them. I found that nowadays I studied Juniper's methods carefully, imagining what I would do or say in the same situation, learning not so much from the herbs she used as from her whole bearing. "If we can get this bit right, the little one will feed again and grow strong," Juniper said, and Jean nodded wearily. Slowly the sadness and fear disappeared from her tired face. It was always the same with Juniper's patients, as if her life and energy flowed into them, and the intolerable became tolerable. Her eyes closed in sleep, and she dozed for perhaps half an hour. I always found these slow, quiet times with Juniper's patients very dull and boring, though Juniper had a way of sitting quite still, as if giving them her entire attention, even when they were sound asleep. I fed the baby a little of some goat's milk that Juniper had brought from a villager. I watered it, and with a spoon slipped a little into the baby's mouth. At first she wriggled angrily and spat it out, arching her little back with surprising strength, but after a little she took some and seemed able to keep it down. "Sing to her," said Juniper, when the baby had taken a little, and I sat on the floor in front of the feeble fire and sang her a lullaby, as I had often done with my youngest cousin. The baby, as if surprised, opened her wide blue eyes and stared in an unfocused way into my eyes before she fell asleep. Jean awoke, looking as if the fever had left her, and she lay staring quietly before her. Juniper had taken the baby, still wrapped in her shawl, from me and placed her in a basket. She carried her over and laid her beside her mother. Jean's eyes turned to Juniper's face, and the look of fear returned. "Be careful," she said urgently. "There are souls in the village who would harm you. You know who I mean. Be careful." Juniper took her hand. "Thank you," she said. "I know what you mean, and I will take care. Don't be afraid yourself. You need not tell anyone we have been here, you know." Perhaps it was because I had lived in the village and Juniper had not, that I knew it was too late for such caution. Everyone would know that we had seen Jean. As we made our way along the wet, rutted street, the puddles splashed our clothes. Nobody was around to greet us. Under the eaves of 2 or 3 of the cottages I noticed bunches of fennel and rowan hanging. "What are they for?" I asked Juniper. "A specific against witches," she added shortly. I wondered if she felt frightened at what Jean had said, but she seemed exactly the same as usual, calm, cheerful, somehow ordered inside herself. I pushed the dark fear away from me. "I am sorry about your shawl," I said. "It was such a lovely colour." There was an east wind blowing, and I saw Juniper shiver involuntarily. She did not reply. After our meal that night we sat silently by the fireside. "Coleman says we might be in danger," I said at last, "that I should not go to Mass nor visit my cousins." "There is danger," she said. "Or rather, there will be, if the smallpox comes from the mainland. If not, then I think we will get through this winter, and Phelan can do nothing against me." "Why does he hate you so much?" "I think he misunderstands. He thinks I am working against the new religion. But it is not so. I love and revere Jesus as he does. How could one not? But in the new religion they think that nature, especially the human body, must be fought and conquered. They seem to fear and distrust matter itself, although in the Mass it is the bread and wine that is used to show how spirit and matter are one. They think that those like the Dorans, who love and cherish nature, must be fought and conquered too. Jesus did not tell them this. It is their own invention because they fear nature, their own and that of others. If the smallpox comes, what will they do?" hope you will get away. To Furkill, perhaps. Before anything happens. For myself, I shall have to wait and see. They are cruel to witches sometimes, I said, not liking to put the idea into words. Indeed, said Juniper. Remember that if you should hear that I have renounced anything or betrayed anyone. You, I gasped in astonishment. You could not do that. Fear, pain, and loneliness might make anyone say anything, said Juniper. I hope that I should be brave and strong, but there is no knowing. Is this why you want me out of the way? I said, in a sudden flash of grown-up wisdom. So at least you need not worry about what they do to me. That is one reason, she said. I struggled with this information. I loved Juniper and wanted to stay with her and be brave as she was, but I was also frightened of what might happen. I just hope the smallpox won't come, I said doggedly. Whatever happens, wise child, we trust one another to do the best we can, and we love one another. This is the weapon that they cannot take from us. In the end, it makes us stronger than they are. I suddenly realized that Juniper was entirely unafraid. She calculated what they might do to her if the smallpox came, and she measured her own strength as best she could, in the hope that she would not betray her friends if they tortured her. But in the core of her, she was untouched by the sense of threat, as cheerful and confident as she had always been. I do like knowing you, I said, stammering. Really, I was trying to say something much more difficult, that through her, as though through a window, I could see the love that was woven through every fibre of the world. In the days and weeks that followed, the little bunches of herbs that hung in the eaves of the people's houses grew more numerous, and the requests for Juniper to visit sick people grew fewer and fewer, until they finally stopped altogether. When we met people on the road, men and women whom Juniper had helped and healed, they turned away without speaking to us. Juniper seemed not to mind, but it made me feel very lonely. I no longer visited my cousins, nor became an ordinary villager again for the length of the Mass. Worse than that, however, was the dread that hung over us, the dread that Furlong would work out his old grudge against Juniper in a terrible way. There was nothing we could do but wait for times to get better, for a return to the happy days when Juniper had visited sick people, for the spring and the time when people would be less hungry. I found it hard to concentrate on anything, to get on with lessons or the preparing of herbs for people who no longer wanted Juniper to visit them. In spite of our waiting, when the blow fell, it came as a surprise. I had gone out one day across the bog in search of a plant Juniper needed when, long before I reached home, I saw Cormac in the distance. I think I knew at that very moment that disaster had struck, but I went on quickly until I stood before him. Cormac's face, though scared, was now very nearly healed. They have arrested Juniper, he said simply. The smallpox has arrived, and Furlong used it to stir up feelings against her, as we feared. Of course, they are waiting for you at the White House. I think Juniper hoped you might somehow flee to Furkill, but I do not think you will get so far. I stood on the track, rooted with terror. I'm frightened, I said. At that moment, I felt a presentiment that both Juniper and I would be burned as witches. I knew that I had no alternative to being arrested. Furlong would have the ferries to the mainland watched, and I would never get to Furkill. But I wanted a little more time before I fell into their hands. May I come to your hut, I asked, just for an hour or two? For most of the day, Cormac and I sat together in his hut. You know that I wouldn't do anything for Juniper, he said. You know that I would do anything for Juniper, he said, and for you too. I took Cormac's hand in gratitude and comfort in his brown eyes. In a way, it's a relief it's come, I said. It was awful, waiting, feeling all the people had turned against Juniper. And I am going to pause there.